Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 8 of series 8. Now the question for today is, are the four states of cognition, affect, will and value exhaustively comprehensive? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, the introduction. So these workshops are focused on the two themes of consciousness and value. This is because I define problems of human existence in terms of consciousness, and I offer solutions in terms of value, namely the will to value or an affirmation of value. But both the concepts of consciousness and value have often been regarded as difficult to understand. In clarification, John Searle provisionally defines consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. And to further clarify both consciousness and value, I propose a four-state classification of consciousness. These are the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. Yet I'm also proposing that these four states are exhaustively comprehensive of consciousness. So I'm asking everyone and looking for exceptions to this classification of cognition, affect, will and value. For example, I'm asking whether personal identity can be explained as part of this classification. Personal identity is an interesting feature because of its holistic character. Yet this suggests that it can be included within the general concept of consciousness as self-consciousness. Moreover, both personal identity and self-consciousness can also be understood as knowledge or self-knowledge. And Paul Ricoeur and others identify personal identity with internalized values to determine who I am. Yet these supposed exceptions refer back to the classifications of cognition, affect, will and value. And this is how we can use them as building blocks of further understanding. Yet we have previously defined both consciousness and value in several other different ways. Different theories like dualism and pluralism offer different views which inform our understanding. Phenomenology looks to structures of consciousness like intentionality and temporality. And not to be forgotten is the first person experience that we have as conscious beings. My own view, is an interactionist account of mind and a structural conception of consciousness as a process and relation. Briefly, this means that the origins and development of mind is explicable in interactions with the world, and that consciousness can be best explained with structures like intentionality and divisibility. To understand the proposed classification of the four states, we can compare it with other classifications. Immanuel Kant posed three faculties of mind: Ekonnen, Empfinden and Wollen, or cognition, feeling and will. Analytic philosophy typically reduces this to cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. It also assumes clear distinctions between these states without overlap, and both Kant's and the analytic classification omit value as a mental state. And as well as a neglect of value, they also bias cognition and epistemology prevalent in Western thought. A few exceptions are Nietzsche, Kierkegaard and religion. But religion typically has no concept or theory of value. So I'll supplement the above classifications with the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. I'll just give brief definitions of these four states before expanding them later. Cognitive states are those like belief, reason and knowledge, which necessarily entail mental objects. Affect states are feelings like pleasure and fear and are constituted by their own experience. The will is a mental drive or motive to act, which draws upon cognition, affect and value. Value is a state with features like quality, preference, privilege and affirmation. I explain the function and significance of these four states elsewhere and in other workshops. Yet I can further explicate them below in comparisons and in arguing for their comprehensiveness. Comparable classifications can be found in both the social sciences and in the work of Sartre. We can make a comparison with Sartre's constitution of the ego he describes as actions, states and qualities. With respect to affect, Sartre explains his states are states like hate, love and jealousy that are affect states. But we may wonder how he can incorporate physical action into a constitution of the ego. Yet action need not always be physical, as in the case of mental acts and speech acts. And as noted earlier, the force of intent required to motivate action can be described as the will. We will make use of this later to provide a close comparison between action and will. With respect to a comparison between Sartre's qualities and what we call values, Sartre writes, the qualities of the ego represent the ensemble of virtues, latent traits, potentialities which constitute our character and our habits. This is comparable to description of values. But it isn't directly comparable because Sartre does use the word value elsewhere. Yet with respect to cognition, Sartre doesn't refer to cognition at all as a noun or as something in itself, but he uses its active form as the verb recognition 67 times in his work Being and Nothingness. Before considering problems of particular states, we should consider problems of the idea of classification itself. That is, what are the criteria and perspectives by which classifications are justified? For example, the classification of animal, vegetable and mineral is determined by being basic objects in the world. But exceptions like quantum events or logical abstractions might be cited to challenge this classification. So two ways of challenging classifications is by their points of view and by exceptions. We can then apply these to cognition, affect, will and value as aspects of consciousness. And we can say here that consciousness is the determinant of a point of view. Yet with some justification, we can say that consciousness has a privileged point of view. This is because we can argue that consciousness is fundamentally what we are, and consciousness determines a point of view from which we cannot escape. So we can provisionally use that inescapability to justify that point of view. Then the justification of the categories of cognition, affect, will and value will be tested shortly. That is, by looking at their credentials as constituents of consciousness, as well as by looking at whether exceptions can be found to their comprehensiveness. So we are considering whether the four states of cognition, affect, will and value are exhaustively comprehensive. And another way of doing this is by their potential as human objectives. The idea of a human objective is another determinant of a point of view underlying this inquiry. So for this reason, we should also consider the general category of consciousness itself. But the general character of consciousness seems to prevent any specific property being named as an objective. That is because consciousness can be characterized as a multiplicity of states rather than a single entity. New Age thinking and some cults adopt consciousness as an objective, but it is untenable as such. That is, if we did single out a specific property, then that property would be the objective, not consciousness. A couple of properties to consider, though, are personal identity and intrinsic value. But value is already both included in the proposed classification and is a candidate human objective. And personal identity is an anachronistic objective that we'll discuss shortly. And if the property is the potential of consciousness for development, then that appears to be a quantification of consciousness rather than a specific property. But the problem for consciousness as a human objective, which should bring solutions, is that it's problematic. That is, its increase incurs problems of anxiety, anomie, alienation, fragmentation, guilt and pain. So we are returned to considering cognition, affect, will and value as properties of consciousness. Yet another problem for consciousness is the claim that it doesn't really exist, as physicalists maintain. Daniel Dennett, for example, argues that consciousness only has a notional existence, like unicorns. Another view is that only disparate mental states exist, not consciousness as a singular entity. Margaret Thatcher made a similar claim that society doesn't exist, only people and workers exist. This is difficult to argue here, but consciousness does have a unity around personal identity in time and space. That is, consciousness is centered around my body and brain on one continuous timeline. I don't have perceptions over there, feelings in a different place, and values in another. And self-consciousness has a personal identity that centers itself with the statement that I am. Yet consciousness is also constituted by mental states such as cognition, affect, will and value. So we must now briefly examine each of these states in turn. The consideration of these states as properties of consciousness also depends upon their comprehensiveness. This is because we want to know how they are part of the amalgam of consciousness. In case of cognition, cognition consists of states like belief, perception, memory and knowledge. Cognition can be more technically defined as being constituted by its intentional or cognitive objects. Conversely, non-cognitive states are constituted by the very experience of that state. Although non-cognitive states can involve or intend towards cognitive objects. As indicated above, in analytic and existential philosophy, cognition is taken as an aspect of consciousness by default. This is explained by their shared belief that consciousness is conscious of something. Reflective consciousness can also be explained as knowing that one is conscious. These explanations indicate the close identification of cognition with consciousness. The place of cognition in a typology of mind is also secured by its significance in the cognitive non-cognitive debate. Issues here are about the cognitive or non-cognitive explanations of activities like morals, motivation and meaning. The point is that analytic philosophy is using these two states as exhaustively comprehensive, but as non-cognitive states include all non-cognitive states, this isn't a specific classification. In the cognitive non-cognitive debate, an analytic philosophy typically has a preference for cognitive explanations. Cognitivists hold that non-cognitive explanations are blind and can't guide action. Non-cognitivists hold that cognitive explanations are impotent and can't motivate behavior. But more significant here is that the implied fact-value distinction traditionally excludes value from cognitive states. Logical positivism, for example, regards values as meaningless because they have no cognitive content. But phenomenological, structural, existentialist and other views oppose this binary and isolated view of mental states. And on a graduated account of mind, there are no pure states, they all interpenetrate each other. We'll say more about these different views of mind shortly. But we can say that on a cognitivist and binary view, non-cognitivist explanations are broadly inclusive of states like happiness, emotion and values. But these different states should be individually distinguished to recognize their significance. Hence the usefulness of the categories of affect, will and value, as well as cognition. Affect states can be said to include all feelings such as happiness, pain, pleasure and emotion. And these states are extensively discussed in the context of utilitarianism. I won't dispute utilitarianism here, but its examination also provides better understanding of happiness and affect. You'd have several criticisms of happiness as either a human or ethical objective. My main criticism is that happiness is blind. It doesn't answer the why or how of life. It's very nice to be happy, but reflective consciousness requires more. Human consciousness entails purpose and value that happiness doesn't provide. And my central criticism of happiness as a value or an intrinsic value is that it need not always be a value. I could regard happiness as encouraging weakness, as a misguided objective, forbidden by God or anything like that. And if happiness need not always be of value, it could not be of intrinsic value. This is an argument if one is needed to consider other states in addition to affect states like happiness. That is, in addition to cognition and affect states, we also require values and value states. We can give some examples of value like desire, wanting, love, hate, morals, aesthetics and bias. Yet these examples illustrate a known problem of the diversity of values to be outlined shortly. That is, many different states may be masquerading as one concept. Elsewhere, I advocate the unity of a certain concept of value with features like subjectivity, preference and quality. I begin to outline a need for such a specific concept of value shortly. Yet in the absence of that account, we can also define value functionally and ostensively. Some functional and ostensive definitions of value can also indicate the significance of value at the same time. For example, in religion, God represents the believer's highest value. Love is a mode of value with different kinds of love presenting different kinds of value. Politics is described by David Easton as the authoritative allocation of values. Economics is the quantification of material value in terms of monetary tokens. More significantly, I argue that value is central to such key concepts of human life as well as to philosophy of life. And it's also been well argued that value can be found in every human activity. That doesn't mean that these activities are valuable, but they are value laden. More specifically, classifications of different types of values can be easily found. One of these is the three types of perspectival, motivational, and experiential values. The problem again is whether all these states can be properly described as values. Perspectival values don't even seem to have subjective experiential content. Numerical and truth values seem to be values analogously better described as quantifications. Yet we need not be tied to the linguistic implications of numerical and truth values. We can simply exclude them as pseudo values. And then values would only describe a class of things with properties like preference, privilege, and subjectivity. As for subjectivity, Ralph Perry and others argue that values don't exist until someone desires something. John Mackey also implies subjectivity in his argument that there are no objective values. And the idea of quality as a property of value is also a subjective mental projection. A second problem is the argument that value doesn't exist and only exists as a construct or collective of various values. But I would argue against this view that value doesn't exist because it is only a collective concept. That is, its collectivity doesn't diminish its significance as a collection of mental states that we call value. That value is a general concept or a collective noun doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. A third supposed problem is that there are no pure states of value which might invalidate the classification. For example, the social scientist Tristram Engelhardt holds that knowledge is always value laden. Anthony Grayling described the world as being saturated with values, and Hilary Putnam put it in terms of the breakdown of the fact-value dichotomy. But this concatenation of states is only a problem for the notion of pure, isolated and inviolable mental states. For example, Richard Rorty holds that cognitive and non-cognitive states, I quote, don't seem to have anything in common except a refusal to call them physical. But on the view that I advance here, there are no pure states. They all interpenetrate each other. But there is another similar problem for what we have called motivational or moral values. We may value things but not act to achieve them because of weakness or conflicts of value. Yet the extra ingredient required to motivate action is described as the will, as noted earlier. The will can be described as a fundamental aspect of mind for the following reasons. Because of the earlier noted motivational function, its relations with value and its constitutional function. The relations of the will to value can be differentiated into its various aspects of value. For example, wanting is a directional capacity of the will that implies value. Choice is a selective capacity of the will that implies value, and loving and hating are positive and negative affective capacities of the will that also imply value. The will is construed as an objective in certain Teutonic thinking, in Schopenhauer and in Nietzsche. The will is constituted of value, but as a means to an end, it is idiosyncratic as a human objective. The will isn't a state that can be pursued, it is a relation or process towards an end. The will implies value, but is neither a value in itself nor an intrinsic value. The discussion above indicates the need for a classification in terms of cognition, affect, will and value. Yet the cognitive-non-cognitive distinction was also found to be complete, but lacking in specificity. Can we say the same thing of the classification of cognition, affect, will and value? We need to consider alternatives to these four states to test their comprehensiveness. We could first consider unconscious mental states as a possible exception to this classification. They don't seem to be classifiable as any of the states of cognition, affect, will and value. And many, like Sartre, insist that unconscious events aren't even mental states because they are unconscious. On this view, we can accept the unconscious as an aspect of mind, but not of consciousness. But even the unconscious must be explained in terms of cognition, affect, will and value. How else can we explain the content of unconscious events? But another possible exception might be abstractions like truth or mathematics. Yet abstractions can be regarded as cognitive representations of anthropocentric constructions. But the universality defies their straightforward classification as aspects of cognition. Yet on a standard objectivist view, truth and mathematics would be considered properties of the world. Or on a pluralist ontology, they could be considered as parts of another mode of existence. Yet like physical objects, abstractions would be apprehended through cognition. And like abstractions, very few people regard physical objects as mental states. So again, abstractions do not seem to be exceptions to the proposed classification. A third possible exception is personal identity, especially the kind proposed by Barry Dainton. Dainton makes a distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. He does this with the idea of teleportation, where people are changed into data and teleported somewhere else. They are reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, their psychological self. But the question is, are they the same person? They think they are the same person because they have the memories of the same person. But Dainton considers that teleportation is a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self wouldn't have the same phenomenal identity as the previous person. This thought experiment distinguishes the phenomenal self from the psychological self. But the phenomenal self is an aspect of consciousness that excludes psychological aspects of personal identity. That is, memories in cognition or affect states, inclinations of will and values. But personal identity is a primary aspect of the general condition of consciousness. So I would include personal identity for holistic and cognitive reasons noted earlier. Postmodernists pose a very different objection to such classifications as cognition, affect, will and value. That is, even using such terms restricts us to a modular or classificatory way of thinking. This is because such classifications are oversimplifications of discourse which cannot have such boundaries. This postmodernist critique is an extension as well as a criticism of the structuralism of Saussure and Levi-Strauss. Derrida claims meaning are both historical and structural, relating to immediate meanings in language. In his obscurantist style, Derrida refers to diachronic and synchronic kinds of signs or meanings. For Derrida, this means that meanings really refers to all other references which are absent. But this cannot be done till the full meaning of anything can't be fully articulated. So the postmodernist critique is of any form of universalization, privileged meanings, or classifications. I'm skeptical whether the postmodernist theory of meaning or non-meaning is either coherent or takes us further than the standard critiques of language and Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning. That is, the conclusion that there are no fixed, absolute, or definitive meanings, leaving us with the idea that the mountain has brought forth a mouse. My response is to agree with the classification of cognition, affect and value isn't complete or absolute, and that authentic philosophical discussion can only be conducted in ambiguity and vagueness, but that without the categories of consciousness, cognition, affect, will and value, discussion of human experience would be directionless, empty and incoherent. In conclusion, we can reiterate two origins of the classification of cognition, affect, will and value. These were the limitations of the cognitive non-cognitive distinction in analytic philosophy, and a comparison with Sartre's constitution of the ego as actions, states and qualities. I then considered consciousness as an inclusive category, yet unsuitable itself as a human objective. Cognition was presented as a primary category because consciousness is conscious of something. Yet affect, will and value were needed to explain human experience comprehensively. Yet value is privileged over affect and value, affect and will, because only value is able to provide meaning, purpose and a why of life. This is even though the concept of value faces problems of diversification and coherence. We then considered possible exceptions to the proposed classification. These took the forms of unconscious mental events, mathematical abstractions and personal identity. And I held that personal identity can be included as an aspect of consciousness and cognition. The final challenge of postmodern critiques to such classifications was found to be largely vacuous, and that the concepts of cognition, affect, will and value appear to remain as the building blocks for a coherent understanding of human existence as consciousness. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com and philosophy of value workshops.